Hello, welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. Today I'm continuing with Robert McKee's story, still working through it, and today's chapter is Chapter 9, Act Design. Now this may seem where when we speak about acts and scenes, normally those are used to describe plays and film scripts, but novels also have acts and scenes, and depending on how long your novel is, you would maybe have the typical 3 acts for a long novel, or maybe if it's a novella, you would have 2 acts. There has to be some kind of progression to turning points. And if you don't have that, maybe like McKee talks about the stream of consciousness novel, maybe doesn't work that way. So it's not carved in stone, but if you know this basic concept, I think it will help you shape your novel into something that is that has that development. You know, it's when like even I'm reading Anne Rice's The Witching Hour, and that is not a typical 3-act structure at all. It goes into this whole like historical period that has its own story that builds into a climax, and then it goes switches back into the present time and what's happening in that and how these stories interact with each other, and it's complex to say the least. Is it successful? I think so. I enjoy it, but I have read some reviews that have complained about that. It doesn't follow like I was just doing my TBR, a book like Harvest Home, which is a horror novel, which is in my TBR. I've read this before. This follows a very classical design of a 3-act structure. But whether you're doing 2 acts or 3 acts or even like 1 act if it's a short work, the most important thing is that you have what McKee calls progressive complications, moving towards this point of no return, where the protagonist tries different things. I mean, this was mentioned in the earlier chapters. They try to solve a problem, and the more they try, the more complicated things get, more complex and more painful. People say beat up your protagonist. I think that's really true, because what you're really doing is, well, you're not beating them up, but you're involving your reader in this complex story, this problem-solving process, and they're asking themselves the whole time, maybe in an unconscious way, but they're like, what would I do? How would I get out of the situation? So you're involving them in these complications. To complicate means to make life difficult for characters. I said beat them up, but it's basically the same thing. To complicate progressively means to generate more and more conflict as they face greater and greater forces of antagonism, creating a succession of events that passes points of no return. You always want to build these problems, these progressions that you don't, with more, each one of these progressions has to build in more intensity. You don't want to go back. So let's say in your story, a neighbor is being nosy and she's suspicious that maybe her neighbor is a serial killer. I'm just throwing that out there. And each little contact she makes with this neighbor, let's say, has to progress in a more frightening way if you're writing a thriller. So maybe at first, she kind of runs into him and he's like this kind of grumpy guy. And then maybe she then breaks into his house and he comes home and she has to hide in the closet. So each progression has to be more intense and has to put the protagonist at more peril, whether that peril is in a realistic, kind of physical way or in an emotional way. Progressive complications can be an internal thing as well. It doesn't have to be the physical aspect of the protagonist. It can be an internal, emotional kind of progression. Nothing moves us forward in a story except through conflict. This is emphasized throughout this whole book, is about conflict, conflict, conflict. The music of story is conflict. If you get anything out of this book, it's that your story needs conflict. And then he breaks it down into different levels. There's inner conflict, personal conflict, which he calls like a soap opera. A soap opera can be quite enjoyable, but McKee's asking the writer to go a little deeper than that. Complexity, conflict at all three levels is what he recommends. Inner conflict, personal conflict, and extra-personal conflict. This is where the novelist has a jump on the screenwriter, because the novelist can, through like internal monologues and inner thoughts, reveal to the reader what the characters' inner conflicts are. So in the middle of a scene, let's go back to our neighbor, and she's hiding in the closet of the would-be serial killer. What is going on inside her mind? Obviously, she's afraid, but maybe this is triggering some deep memory from her childhood that makes us know more about her and why she's even in this situation. Why was she so curious about this neighbor, and like, what is she getting out of it? What is her internal workings while she's hiding in this closet? A screenwriter would have to do that in a different way. I mean, you could do voiceover narration, although McKee's really kind of famously against doing that, saying it's a bit of a cheat. All right, so act design. This is kind of a funny quote. He goes back to Aristotle. In the Poetics, Aristotle deduces that there is a relationship between the size of the story, how long it takes to read or perform, and the number of major turning points necessary to tell it. The longer the work, the more major reversals. In other words, in his polite way, Aristotle is pleading, please don't bore us. Don't make us sit for hours on those hard marble seats listening to choral chants and laments while nothing actually happens. That's kind of funny. I think we've all read books or where there's, or seen movies where there's this like battle scenes happening and explosions and spaceships going off and all kinds of events, but we're not invested because we're not connecting to the emotional investment, the inner conflict. And sometimes you can see writers trying to infuse their work with that, and if you can see it too much, you're seeing it, you're not feeling it. So that's where I guess the writer's talent comes in, is like how to make that work, and there's no real formula for that. So 3 major reversals are the necessary minimum for a full-length work of narrative art to reach the end of the line. And then he does some charts about different, where the inciting incident comes in, and it can come in immediately, or it can come in late. And you don't want to repeat, and this is important, like each reversal has to be turning point, let's say, in the act, has to be unique. You can't go back and retread one that you've already used. And this is where the writer's art comes into play, where your imagination is really important. I mean, as a writer, I find myself struggling with this sometimes. It's like, well, I already did that, and I already had the car already went off the cliff, so what can I do now that's going to be more dramatic, it's going to top that? Writing, you're thinking logically. It's an interesting process, but because you're thinking logically about these kinds of things, but you're also using your imagination and your emotions and connecting. So it's really kind of a fun experience. I mean, people say writing is hard, and it is hard, but I personally enjoy that process of thinking and feeling at the same time. And it's hard, but it's very rewarding when you find that you're getting it right every once in a while. He mentions the thing that not every scene needs to be like big. If every scene screams to be heard, we go deaf. So make a variety. Again, you don't need to have like a battle in every scene. Build to the battle. Make that battle important. Whether it's a courtroom battle or an epic battle like in Game of Thrones. Build to that. Make it count. I've read a lot of books where it's like people are being killed and arms and legs are chopped off, and you're like, all right. Why is it boring sometimes when there's too many battles? Because we're kind of getting numb, and we don't care. So how do you make somebody care about your character? That is an important question. The false ending. If you've read any of my work, and you may if you want, I'm going to link it below, my Wattpad page. One of my favorite writers is Ira Levin, who wrote The Stepford Wives. He wrote Kiss Before Dying. He wrote Rosemary's Baby. He wrote a great play called Death Trap, and all of those works have great twists or the false ending. Great writer O. Henry was famous for his twists. So yeah, use a twist. I love them personally as a reader, and I do them as a writer. I try to put a twist in every thing I've ever written. Actually, every one of my novels or in short stories, I've had a twist. Sometimes successful, sometimes maybe a little lame, but I try. He uses the example of Terminator, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, as a wonderful false ending. When you do a false ending or a twist, let's say, it's either going to go from something bad to something good, or from something good to something bad. And if you're doing horror, it's okay to have the down ending. He writes about subplots. So a subplot usually it's like a different genre can be a subplot for a major genre. Let's say, okay, so it's like 50 Shades of Grey. The love story is the main plot, but there can be like this espionage story going on. That's a subplot. Or if you have an action film about espionage is the main plot, the love story can be the subplot. Your subplots can involve other characters that thematically mirror your major plot. I mean, Shakespeare did that. That's going back to the old structure of comedy, let's say, where you have the serious story going on in the main plot, and then mirroring it is another, let's say, love story, which is more comical. You see that in movies. These are all old forms that anyone writing you don't have to use them, but you should know them. And you already do know them. If you watch movies and you read books, you already know them. Maybe you don't know what they're called, or you didn't know that they were an actual form. That's why you should read this book. Subplot may be used to complicate the central plot. He uses the example of one of my favorite neo-noir films from the 80s. In Black Widow, a federal agent, Deborah Winger, becomes infatuated with the killer herself, Teresa Russell. I really like that movie. If you've never seen that, it's really good. Talks about Casablanca as having all these subplots. So whether you are writing a novel or a screenplay, think about in terms of acts and how each act builds to a turning point that progresses. So it gets more and more intense, higher stakes, till you build to that final climax and resolution. If you think about your novel that way, you can have really good structure. It doesn't have to follow a formula per se, but if you are aware of it, you can make those choices deliberately and not just throw caution to the wind and hope it works out. Once you identify these forms, then you'll see them everywhere. Where you've been seeing them before in movies and books, maybe you didn't know that's what they were called. But knowing the 3-act structure is really going to improve your writing tremendously. Just as a little side note, one of my favorite booktubers, the Bald Book Geek, did a video about Zenith, about the book Zenith and why it was such a dismal failure. And I did comment on his video. And that book really needed this book, or a book like it, even a basic primer in structure, just to give it that kind of cohesion, which it didn't have. So next time I'll be looking at chapter 10, scene design, and breaking it down even further. So thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon. Bye.